Today, we're going to be talking about ad tiers in streaming services because this has been one of the big disappointments. And I think as the quarterly reports start rolling in, and they've started, this morning's was NBC Universal's, we are going to see more and more kind of vacillating on why the ad tiers are not performing as well as they were supposed to. Remember, originally, the ad tiers were supposed to provide a big backstop and provide a lot more users and subscribers who, for some reason or another, couldn't afford the regular subscription fees. This is actually an example of rather bad corporate thinking, where you started with what your needs were, not with what you thought you could get, not with what you thought would benefit your customers. And so what they did is they backward engineered outward how successful the ad tier would be without ever really thinking, is this going to serve our customer base? Is this going to be something they even like or want? And I'm going to say that this was a huge miscalculation. Let's start with the practicals. The practicals are, what does an ad tier actually mean? Well, certainly for decades and decades, in fact, almost 8 decades at this point, television was supported almost exclusively by advertising. So was cable. So in many ways is YouTube. So why wouldn't the streaming services benefit from an ad tier? The answer is that the ad tier is exactly the opposite of why people go for streaming. People go for streaming precisely to get away from commercials. And I know that there's a lot of people who think, well, yeah, but. No, it's not a yeah, but. That's definitional. The moment you put commercials in it, people are going to say, I'd rather not have it, period. The content alone is not enough to drive them. Because if it was, then we wouldn't be having the problems with linear TV and basic cable that we're having today. Now, admittedly, linear TV and basic cable is still 60% of the market. But there is no doubt that it is slowly going away, and that advertisers are going to need to find a replacement for what was their most lucrative form of advertising. So therefore, there's a lot of need on both sides. So what are the challenges that would prevent streaming services from being ideal for advertising? Let's start with the content. First of all, streaming, just like premium cable, was based around the idea not only of not having advertising, but of having more mature content that could be shown on television. Remember that for many decades, once a movie was done theatrically, it would have as its second window the television premiere. And once we got past the point where the production code was in effect, mainly the mid-60s, that meant that a lot of the movies that were coming out theatrically were not appropriate for television. So what would happen? Well, for the television version, the movie would be edited, and there would be a bug at the beginning of it that would say,
Tonight's film, a suspense thriller, contains references to sexually frank material. Although edited for television, this film may not be suitable for young viewers. Parental discretion is advised.
Now, of course, everyone with an elementary school equivalency diploma would know that that's the sign for a kid to say, I must watch this movie. But it was also something that could tell the parents, you know what? Yeah, this movie was rated R originally, but it's been cleaned up. And to service that, you would have a number of different ways. Now, obviously, the sex scenes would come out. That was a given. Sometimes additional scenes would be shot. For example, in Saturday Night Fever, during the scene when John Travolta is getting himself ready to go out dancing, his dad comes in and talks to him, and there's a poster of Farrah Fawcett on the wall, and the camera zooms in for a close-up of her breast. And obviously, on the television version, they had a cover take on that of John Travolta just continuing to muss with his hair. So it covered up that shot. Same with replacing some dialogue. At one point, Donna Pescow says, "You fuckers." And instead, it's changed to "you fakers." Now, we all know how ridiculous that is, just like in Family Plot. Instead of saying, "Oh, for Christ's sake, Blanche," Bruce Dern says, "Oh, for rice cakes." Now, we always had those moments. But what it did is it made us as youngsters, and I was young at that time, intrigued to see what the original movie looked like. And that was also part of the motivation in the early days of home video, so that you could see these things with uncensored content, with uncensored dialogue. And that's what drew us to it. So there was that need that there was that desire to see something that was uncut and uncensored, and therefore more adult. What was another thing that people will say today? They'll say, "Well, yeah, but you also had shows like All in the Family and MASH." Note, this was all Murderers Row on Saturday night, which started out as an experiment by CBS to see if they could really do more adult content, because they had just canceled Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres and Petticoat Junction and Mayberry RFD and all of the rural shows. And they were kind of nervous because even though those shows were getting large numbers, they were getting very bad numbers in the urban areas. And they were hoping that this would cover for that without losing such a substantial portion of the audience, that it would become untenable for them to not bring some of those shows back. Now, the truth is, this ended up working beautifully. But we were also dealing in an environment where there were only 3 networks. So there were only 3 places that an advertiser could go. So yes, they might not like what was going on with All in the Family initially, but even until the show became popular, they saw the value of it. They saw that this was something that would work in an urban area where they had been having increasing problems. But they still had standards and practices, rules and regulations. And so the show would constantly be a battleground between standards and practices and the showrunner, Norman Lear. Now, Norman Lear had proven himself to be a ratings getter, and he had proven himself to be a very good writer. So therefore, he had credibility, and the ratings are what the advertisers wanted. Yes, if you had a boycott, it could be very bad, but you might actually bring in more people than the boycott would cost you. And that, in fact, is what happened with Murderers Row, whether it be All in the Family, which really looked at bigotry directly in a way that show couldn't be done today. I know they did a live version, but you notice they haven't repeated it, even though it was a good ratings getter. So one would think that would have become a more common programming decision, but it hasn't been, because obviously the pushback has been great enough, and network TV's position with advertisers is not sufficiently strong to where they can say, "So what? Look at the numbers we're getting." Then it was followed by MASH, anti-war. Then it was followed by Mary Tyler Moore, early feminism. Then it was followed by the Bob Newhart Show, first sitcom to be about double income, no kids. This was a married couple who were not interested in having kids. Well, there were a couple of episodes where they talked about it, and fortunately, the response from the audience was like, no, don't go there. And so it didn't happen. Very unlike Mad About You. And then it was followed by the Carol Burnett Show, which was this very weird hybrid of old school Ed Sullivan type musical numbers and skits that had a Rowan and Martin's laughing edge to them, that they were satirical. They were willing to push being offensive. And so that show also kind of fit in with this, yes, it's traditional, but yes, it's also not. So you had this incredible ratings juggernaut that was so successful that in this pre-VCR day, you were able to cause great consternation to restaurants and nightclubs because even young people were staying home to watch these shows. And that's how you were able to get around it at that time. Now there is unlimited choice. There's such unlimited choice that we're at the point where on YouTube, we had what was called the adpocalypse. And of course, what the adpocalypse was, it was positioned that all of a sudden controversial content, particularly right-leaning controversial content, was being censored. Okay, that's a nice excuse, and that happened to work with the Madison Avenue Harvard MBA geniuses of the time who didn't know what was going on in the real world and didn't care. They were just interested in catering to their little niche. And unfortunately, their older bosses who knew better didn't want to bother to learn how to use social media, so they just gave it over. So what these Ivy League MBAs thought was, okay, we're having a problem here. We're having a problem in that we have far more people who qualify to be part of the ad program than we have advertisers. Yes, YouTube is ubiquitous. YouTube is huge. YouTube has a billion viewers, billions of viewers, much more so than linear TV or premium streaming, by the way. You notice those numbers are never conflated in. They don't dare. But the problem was that we needed to figure a way to reduce it. So obviously, the easiest way to do that would be to play to your Twitter crowd, act like you were being virtuous, act like you were actually removing problematic content, when what you were actually doing is you were saying, we need to have a really, really generic and dumbed down and Brady Bunch level of content for these advertisers, because they have a choice. There is so much inventory out there that they can pick and choose. And they're obviously going to pick Dude Extreme or Mr. Beast over something where you have people talking about politics and are creating controversy over their content. So you had a win-win for a minute there, because you were covering your real motivation. You were covering the motivation that you weren't really censoring. You were merely trying to get rid of an entire group of content providers. Because you notice that as much as you have people who are right conservative leaning complaining about how much they were being censored, so too was a great chunk of the more radical left, which was dominating in Twitter. So you had this disconnect where you were having both extremes really cut back. But that was because it was a buyer's market for the advertisers. They could pick and choose. Now, we all know that we're moving into a period where there is a likelihood that we might be having financial crises coming up and facing us. That's going to cut back even more on advertising. So at this period, when we are cutting back on advertising in general, when there's a lot of companies that are becoming very stressed fiscally, three major new players suddenly jump into the ad market and say, look at us, here we are, and come and buy big swatches of advertising from us. Well, the answer is, from where? Okay, an obvious answer is, let's pull more out of YouTube, which has been happening, obviously. The second is, well, let's pull more out of basic out of basic cable and network. But wait, basic cable and network deliver us a very consistent audience. Not only that, it's been so established that we know if we put an ad on this show, this show, and this show, that we're going to have a certain cost per thousand, which is the money we pay for every 1,000 eyeballs that come into the program. So we have an easy way of vetting it, and that is looking at the Nielsen ratings and seeing what those numbers are. You have an established business where you're not taking that much of a risk. Gone are the days when someone will launch an All in the Family or even an NYPD Blue So no, you've got a very conservative mix of programming. So you have a captive audience, so to speak, and moreover, and this is a dirty little secret that nobody likes to talk about. What is the one area that basic cable and linear TV absolutely knock out streaming? You got it. It's with non-Caucasian audiences. The non-Caucasian audience is overrepresented in terms of percentage of the population on the linear channels. It is grotesquely underrepresented on streaming, not YouTube, but on streaming. It's very underrepresented. I mean, we're talking about no more than about 20 to 25% of the audience is non-Caucasian. So if you're making a lot of content that you hope to appeal to a completely diverse audience, you're actually putting it in the wrong place when you put it on streaming. So it's very interesting that you have that particular challenge. Now, what is another problem? Well, streaming, at least the premium side, is largely based on being the anti-network. They are trying to create content that's not available on basic cable or traditional network. So because of that, it is more adult. What does that mean for an advertiser? Now, remember, this is an advertiser who's now in a buyer's market. You have all these people who need your money, so you can pick and choose. Are you really going to go to streaming and say, yeah, we're going to put a lot of ads on a show that is controversial? I know it's now past, but think about Blonde, the Anna de Armas movie about Marilyn Monroe. What advertiser would want their ad put on that show? What advertiser would not be afraid of guilt by association? Ditto for how many other programs? I mean, yeah, okay. You can talk about your Meghan and Harry interviews being great for advertisers, but that could have been a traditional network type program, except that Netflix had more money than common sense to burn at that point, giving them $350 million. But what's the content on streaming that's very advertiser friendly? And on top of that, the streaming services have been very, very reticent about giving out their numbers. If there's okay, you could say, well, this would force the streaming services to give up their real numbers, and therefore it would force them to negotiate fairly with the Writers Guild and with the Screen Actors Guild. You're absolutely right there if that was the case. But the streaming services aren't going to want to do that. Why? The reason they're not going to want to do that is because their numbers, and we know this, because otherwise they would have no problem with it. Their numbers have got to be bad, or at least they have to be under what they're giving everyone the impression they are. Otherwise, they would be boasting about them. And the fact that they went against the Nielsen service and said, we don't think that they're doing things correctly, means that they got a number that they didn't like. And you notice the Nielsen's are now following a month later when the damage has been done. And it doesn't matter anymore because a streaming show is really only good for its first week. Think of your average streaming series as being like the first week of a theatrical release. That's all the value it has. If something's been around for 6 months and somebody said, well, I think I'll watch this someday, guess what? There's a better than 95% chance that they won't. Think about how many people in the old days of being able to TiVo things and off of cable and then watch them later. How likely were you to watch something after a week had passed and you not watching it? How many people had video queues that were literally hundreds of titles? That's the point. So this is why when the cable systems, I mean the streaming services were going in and saying we're now part of advertising, and they expected the advertisers to all jump on board, they had a rather rude shock. And they're still dealing with that consequence. You note that they're still saying that they want to explore this, they want to expand it. But until they're willing to give up real numbers, which they won't, because that would cause too much other problems, this is going to be an impasse. And I do have a suggestion. If they were really serious about wanting to really play their cards properly, as opposed to saying, well, that won't work because we're not going to make the money we want. Take your mind off of that. Think of what will work to get you the most new full paid subscribers. I believe the answer to that is to make your ad tier. This is going to be tough because, again, we're going to have the problem with the content itself. Make the ad tier free. That's the answer. Make the ad tier free. Don't put everything available on the ad tier. And anything that is controversial, have the TV safe version. That way, people can sample yourself for free and either make the decision that, you know what, I'm willing to pay for this, or say, you know what, this stuff isn't that great. I don't care if I can see more blood and nudity later. I just don't like it. But at least you have a way of getting people to sample it. Because right now, having the ad tier be cheaper, you are having the gall to ask people to pay money to see ads, when the whole reason they were willing to pay money was largely to not see ads. That is the challenge. This is why I think that this particular panacea that was supposed to save streaming is not going to.
Drive me crazy, Camellia.
ズワイオクチュール巻きサンシャインシティアルパ1